Cool. Good evening, everybody, to the latest Strategic Defence Studies Centre War Studies seminar. That there are many aphorisms about the importance of logistics, and I'm sure some of the people here will know them. Yet, despite the fundamental criticality of logistics, the conduct of military operations, put very simply, people need food and water, vehicles need fuel and lubricants, weapons need ammunition, etc., etc., etc. Logistics history and logistics historians are quite rare in the broader field of military history. When they come along, they need to be both nurtured and their work promoted. So hence our speaker tonight, Major Ian Finlayson, retired, a career logistician and more recently historian with 2 books published and another 2 on the way, is our speaker. Ian's most recent publication examines the logistical effort to maintain the Australian presence in South Vietnam, which I invite him to present to us tonight.
Good. Well, good evening, gentlemen, and thanks for coming out on this cold Canberra night, as they all are. Oops. No, it's not working.
Hang on. All right, we'll get this. Okay, it should be right.
Right. So, what I want to talk about this evening, or the next 45 minutes, are these topics. It's still not working. All right, maybe there. Does that work? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Plus these ones. This book was primarily written for logistics planners in Army, so it's got a bit of a planning bent towards it in terms of topic, but that's basically why I wrote it. Let's do it. Oh.
Just click over. You just
Yeah, okay. For whatever reason, it's not working. So I guess the first thing that comes along, why is Army logistics history neglected? Next slide. Because there's a number of core histories. Most histories relating to logistics in Vietnam are the core histories, but there's no holistic history of logistics in Vietnam. And indeed, this book, which was published by Cambridge University Press, came out in January. As far as I know, is the only holistic study on this topic. If Martin Van Crevel says that logistics is 90% of the business of war, you wonder why. Even if you have that figure, you wonder why there's not more books on the topic. And some of the possible reasons. This quote from Mackay, who was Commander AFV. Sort of teaches or impinges on some of it. Yep. Again, from my point of view, having been a practicing logistician for the last 40-odd years, I'd say there is a general culture of disinterest in the Army on the topic. When I read this particular comment, I was graduating from Officer Cadet School, Portsea, some 14 years later, but that statement was just as true in 1978 as it was in 1964. And somewhat depressingly, I was lecturing on this topic for the Army's Logistics Officer Advanced course a couple of weeks ago, and again, their sentiments are almost exactly the same. So you have a long-running cultural issue here about Army's regard to logistics. Yep. Next. Of course, this disinterest is also reflected in the writings. You'd think there would be a volume on logistics in World War I, World War II set, but nothing. The Brits do one in their World War I set on transportation on the Western Front. But apart from that, as I say, the only exceptions are medical histories. And for some reason, the doctors always get the ability to have their official history written for whatever reason. Thank you. So why study the Vietnam War? Yep. Well, I think it's interesting for a couple of reasons. Firstly, there's a large air-sea gap, which makes life interesting for logisticians. And it also covers a range of conflicts from low level to medium intensity. Plus, you have a wide range of groups who you can look at. And those are the ones I've listed there, and who I'll basically look at in this presentation. Okay. Really, to understand how Australia operated in Vietnam, you need a basic understanding of how the American system operated, because we're very much intertwined with them, or attempted to be. Thank you. So 62, the US has some 16,000 advisors there already. The first large US Army formations arrived in 65, and US Navy is providing logistic support in I Corps, which is the one on the border with North Vietnam, but the US Army is looking after the rest of the country. Thank you. The deployment of combat troops routinely precedes logistics units. Because they do this, logistics support's always in a catch-up phase. They never quite get ahead of the ball in terms of the units they're supposed to support. And indeed, it wasn't until 1965 that first logistical command is established to manage US Army logistics in Vietnam. Okay. You can just see where the black dots are the major base depots, basically one in each corps, and the white dots are the supporting depots. So they're evenly spread throughout the country. Okay. Yeah, there's a high demand for engineer support, particularly in airfields, storage facilities, and accommodation. And this will be a recurrent theme amongst both Australian experience and American experience. Always short of engineers, always short of engineer stores. Yeah. With so few logistic units in countries, supplies are pushed forward. Pushing means that you send a regular basket of supplies every month or every week, whether you wanted them or not. They just arrive. And rather like the 1916 BF ammunition crisis, this creates a huge blockage at ports. So in Saigon, we get a huge blockage of stores put on docks which can't be cleared because they're just arriving in quantities which are unasked for. And they get the same thing that happens in northern France in 1916, which I think is a pretty interesting historical comparison. Thank you. Just some of the issues with the various categories of supply. It's interesting to note that for major overhauls, etc., they undertake those in Japan or Korea. The Australian Army sends ours all the way back to Australia. But I'll touch on that later. Thank you. Aircraft maintenance, high use of contractors is made because of the complex equipment. And medical, unlike all the other sources of supply, are able to establish their own reporting chain to ASV, which is sort of an interesting thing to consider if you want to establish a dedicated or special line of logistics support. Thank you. So the major points for US Army logistics for the Australians anyway, US assets are already overstretched. While there's no shortage of supply, the US system is chaotic, at least until 1968. But Army Headquarters, AHQ, makes little to no effort to understand the shortfalls of the US Army system before we decide to latch onto it. Thank you. So the first special group we're going to look at is the training team. Thank you. So the training team, unlike other Australian elements in South Vietnam, are stretched throughout the country, and this makes their support requirements somewhat different because they're in small groups all over South Vietnam. Thank you. Commanded by Ted Sarong, of course. Proposal to rely on South Vietnamese logistic support was rapidly rejected, primarily probably for the excuse that we require an increase in Australian personnel, but I don't think there was much confidence in South Vietnamese support. Instead, Army Headquarters reached agreement with Commander ASV to provide support to the Australians. Thank you. So the US Army agrees to provide anything except that which is particularly unique to Australian forces. And in the training team context, that's not much. About the only weapon that we have that's unique is the 9mm pistol or the 9mm Owen gun. So rapidly, AOT personnel are fairly indistinguishable from US Army training advisors. Australia agrees to pay the costs for this supply, but we arrive in Vietnam, or Sarong arrives in Vietnam, with no means to pay the Americans. The embassy wouldn't give them any money, and finally, after big borrowing and stealing, we convinced the US Army to accept a check from Army Headquarters. And that's how it goes on a sort of bi-monthly basis. We scrounge up a check to pay for all these services that we're getting. Thank you. There's no medical evacuation plan outside of the country. So if you're seriously wounded, you can't go to Clark Airfield because there's no diplomatic recognition. There is an irregular flight from Saigon, but the Chief of the Air Staff cancels it because he reckons nobody wanted it. That's what he heard in the mess. It was not until 1964 that there's a dedicated detachment flying out of Saigon, and that belongs to the Australian Embassy. Thank you. It is cold up in the highlands, and cold weather gear was in short supply because nobody really thought about it. There was a clothing store from the Far East Land Forces available in Singapore, but Sarong was adamant that he'd rather have no stores than have responsibility for operating the stores account out of Singapore. Sarong is very much a man of his time in that sort of attitude and regard. Logistics was just seen as something which is a problem to be solved rather than an integral part of the force that you deployed with. And I can say that because I basically worked for the equivalent of him when I was a young officer. All of my OCs and lieutenant colonels were of his similar generation and similar attitude. You get the expansion of the training team. Colonel Jackson becomes CO of both Australian Army Force of Vietnam and the AATV, but he still has the same number of staff running staff and logistics issues. One ATF comes into a dependency relationship with one OSG for resupply. We'll talk about that a bit later. But the experience is not a happy one for either party because neither of them really want to have anything to do with each other. Yep. We see a growth in local support memorandum between AATV and Special Forces groups. So initially there was an overarching country memorandum, which there still is, but because this is really meeting the requirements, training team guys just go out and make their own agreement with their local Special Force commanders. So by 1968, with the withdrawal of forces, training team logistics now become a mixture of ARVN and SASR log support. By 1970, log service was so poor, the training team finally bites a bullet and establishes a logistics cell with the Logistic Support Group and sort of formalises a relationship really that they should have had in the first place when they first arrived. Yeah, right. Let's talk about Logistic Support Company. Next one. So 65 Australia officers of battalion to the US government. 1RO becomes a part of the new brigade of 173rd Airborne. Again, agreement is reached between Army Headquarters and the Americans to provide support. It's similar to the training team support, but again, this time 1OAR is required to come fully equipped with Australian weapons and equipment, and also to provide necessary planning data to the Americans for any logistic support they require, which is a change from what happened before. Yep. So the force itself, or the logistics force to support 1OAR, was designed by the Director of Operations and Plans, who's not a logistician, having worked in operations and plans when it still existed. He was more concerned with the operational side of the house rather than the logistics side of the house. So what evolves is an ad hoc logistics support structure. And the rationale was full logistics support's not required because the Americans will provide most of what they need, apart from those Australian equipment. You can see the dates it was raised and it became operational. Raising and making a unit operational in 30 days is too short a time frame. But anyway, that's all they got. And it wasn't until the 13th that they actually told me they were going. And here's where they deployed, near Bin Ho, big air base there. Basically, they were there for a year. Okay. Here's a diagram of if you go to 1OAR and go down, you'll see the headquarters of 1LSC and go down further, and those are all the subcomponents of what contributed the support company. It is interesting to note that the 1APC troop, which is now firmly under the 1OAR line, originally was part of 1LSC because the carriers had been bought, but nobody knew how to operate them and deploy them. So I thought, let's give them to the Logistic Support Group. And to be fair, they were actually a very good vehicle for resupply. But of course, they were an even better vehicle for the movement of infantry. And that's how they end up in 1OAR. Thank you. Where they land up, environmental conditions for the support company are pretty poor. There's no water supply, and they deploy with no defence stores. Defence stores are particularly, steel pickets, barbed wire, things to dig holes with. Because the assumption was back in the Army headquarters, they can just get those sort of stuff off the Americans. What they didn't realise that 173rd Airborne was a light brigade, and they didn't cut those sort of things around much themselves either. So they had nothing to spare. Thank you. Generally, engineering detection, 1 officer and 20 diggers was adequate for the multitude of tasks they were given. They asked for US Army support, but again, the Americans had none to spare. Next one. Yep. By June, all their stores had arrived, but significantly quantities were badly packed, incorrectly consigned or damaged. And tonnage in particular was in a pretty poor state. In a country where there's a lot of rain, that's a fair drawback. They did have the ability to buy things locally through local purchase, but that power was restricted because basically the financial advisor didn't trust them. Rations, again, based on US Army scales, and this is a perennial problem of asking Australian soldiers to eat foreign food. They don't like it. And there's always grumbling, if not more. Thank you. PLL was supplied by several contractors, but again, with a reconnaissance flight, there wasn't the sort of fuel required for 2 of their 4 aircraft. Ammunition overall was supplied by the US Army, and the majority of medical stores come out of the US Army. Thank you. When the announcement of 1LSG was advised, that really set the death knell of 1LSC. And almost immediately, personnel was started to be posted out of the unit. So for a unit which has got a lot of staff work to be done in terms of transferring stores and also winding itself down, the manpower it had to do that was continually decreasing. Had to move some 3,000 tonnes of stores to Vung Tau, but this went had significant issues. Okay. Those that couldn't be moved were put in a big hole and buried. Those which were moved to Vung Tau were literally just dumped on the side of the road. So the incoming troops had no idea what was in what pile. The CO relinquishes command, goes back to Australia, and I can find no evidence that the lessons that they learned operating with the Americans for 12 months was passed on to anybody, let alone anybody in Army headquarters, or that Army headquarters asked. So let's talk about 1LSG. Just to orientate yourself, if you go back one. The beach up in the top left-hand corner, that's the site. Thank you. That's the site of where the ground they occupied. If you move over to the right where the town is, that's Vung Tau itself. And just off picture there is the Vung Tau port. You see referred to the inner harbour and the outer harbour. The inner harbour is up on the top right-hand side, and the outer harbour is on the top left-hand side. That's where the Sydney would come and unload. The airfield, obviously, the airfield is surrounded by US Army and US Air Force logistics units. So that's basically the layout. Thank you. There's the harbour I was talking about. That ship in the foreground there is the Jarvis Bay. And the other ship, I'm pretty sure, is one of the American electrical ships. They had 3 ships in harbour which provided electricity to the US bases and also the Australian base. So 1ATF is raised in February, and you can see the force composition. 1LSG was a new unit. Even though there was an existing brigade logistics structure, or LSF, in existence, Army decided not to deploy it. Instead, it raised a new unit. Thank you. 1ATF strength was that of which 937 belonged to the support group. There's no evidence that logisticians were involved in the determining of the force structure of 1ATF. So basically what happened is the arms guys determined what the force requirement was, and the leftover numbers were given to the logistician to say, here, design a structure out of that. Again, the assumption was that you only needed an ad hoc bespoke organisation because the US Army would provide the majority of things you need. Thank you. Again, there's another support agreement, and you can see the conditions there. It's interesting to note that Australian equipment would be substituted with US Army equipment where possible. That condition was never really honoured in any meaningful sense, except probably for the adoption of the M16 over obsolete weapons like the Owen gun. Yep. 1LSG is raised on that date, and here's the initial unit composition. Yep. This, I don't expect you to read this, but this is a Y diagram of 1LSG. I've not been able to find an original copy, so I've drafted this from the documents that I've been able to find. So I think this is about 90% correct, but I wouldn't say it's 100% correct. The other thing to note about it is that for a lieutenant colonel, it's a huge span of command, much too big. And there's belated recognition of that several years down the track when the CO is made a full colonel rather than a lieutenant colonel. Okay. Lieutenant Colonel D. Rouse, the guy in the slouch hat, he's an infantry officer. He's the first CO. He does an excellent job, but I will note he's not a logistician. Next. So why was it located at Vung Tau and 1ATF at Phuc Tuy? Firstly, Phuc Tuy was selected for those reasons. It wasn't on a border anywhere. And also Army headquarters regarded the terrain in Phuc Tuy it's similar to that in Malaya, and they had experience in counterinsurgency in Malaya. Was Garth program. Thank you. It's 1ATF is put in the centre of Phuc Tuy for operational reasons. It's that distance from Nui Dat. And Vung Tau was considered suitable for all these reasons for 1LSG. But all those reasons were valid ones. Yes. So there you can see the relationship to each other. There's Vung Tau down in the bottom left-hand corner there. And you follow the road up Highway 15 and you get to 1ATF in Nui Dat. Thank you. This is 1ATF in 1971 after well developed. You can see Luscombe Field. Most of the logistics units are centred around the airfield in one way or another. And you can see the large helipad next to SAS Hill there, where most of the airmobile operations were conducted out of. Thank you. There were obvious advantages in co-locating the two, but this was never seriously considered by Army headquarters. But it's interesting to note in 1968 at the CGS exercise, when there was planning to put a division into Vietnam, that consideration of co-location was given and then was regarded as a good thing. It wasn't seen that way in 1966. The actual location of LSG was the city's rubbish dump. It was in sand dunes, high salt water table, no fresh water. In fact, you couldn't pick the worst site, really. Next. You can see a photo. This is what the terrain looked like. And effectively, those engineer units at the level of all those sandhills down to one level across a rather large area. But that's what the original site looked like. Yeah. Operation Hardyhood was the mission to get 1ATF to Vietnam, and it was a three-phase operation as outlined there. Phase one saw the movement of the troops and stores were basically carried, we went by air, stores were basically carried by ship. And Qantas was still regarded as a strategic air force asset at this stage, which is why they were used. There wasn't a case of, do you want to do this? It was a case, you are doing this. Yep. HMA at Sydney. This is before the LCM8s were added to the side, which enabled it to discharge its own cargo. Yep. Phase one is really marked by inadequate planning by Eastern Command and Army headquarters. And there's a shortage of almost every type of store and equipment that the task force required. Again, the rate of concurrent activity expected of the logistics troops was too high. And Mackay, who actually had cited the task force in Phuc Tuy in the first place and later becomes Commander AFE, observes, you know, Australia's made it, but only with a lot of US assistance. In fact, if there had been any sort of interference, I think the deployment would have collapsed. Yep. Phase two sees the task force move to that, and then the first resupply convoys commence. With that, almost immediately runs out of fresh water, and the convoys are typically comprise those loads, ammunition, water, and fuel load. Many of the initial vehicles return unloaded and full because the task force couldn't correctly estimate what their supply requirements were. Yep. Yep. So post-Hardyhood, tonnages which moved to 1ATF significantly increase. And again, especially those engineer stores, because the sand is unsuitable to make concrete and there's no gravel there. It has to come from American sources. Stores are moved by a combination of road and air and also LSM. And the unloading to Sydney or the Japan is a major activity which stops work not only in 1LSG, but also elements of the task force have to come and provide support to unload the ship. Yep. Rouse is replaced by Chambers, and Chambers is the only one of the 7 commanders who is actually a trained logistician. All the others are armed corps officers. He conducts a reorganisation of the headquarters and a new defence plan. Of course, while all this is going on, disease and discipline are significant issues. As you can see, drunkenness and a whole range of other diseases. Yep. That's Chambers in the middle, John Wilton on the right. LSG external command relations were difficult in that they weren't defined by Army headquarters. So Chambers and all the commanders were given a job, but they were not told what this job was going to be or how they're supposed to operate in terms of their responsibilities. Yeah. I'll keep moving this along because we're running out of time. Yeah. Basically, and this quote from David Horner really sums it up. So LSGs had responsibilities, but not authority to manage the internal operations of the logistics system in South Vietnam, which for an organisation which is responsible and not to have authority is nonsense. Yep. Main features: high dependency on US stores, refrigeration which couldn't accommodate US stores. Yep. Bulk fuel, comes from the US Army tankers. There is a sort of internal auction system which decides what stores are being delivered where and how they're going to be delivered at the start of every day, but I won't go into that. But again, no, engineering construction stores are still in short supply and continue demand. And the important thing to note, prior to 1968, it's basically a static model. So there's a shuttle run between Vung Tau and 1 ATF. Supply quantities are adjusted every day, but they don't practice, or nor is there a requirement of mobile operations either inside the province or outside of the province. Yep. Yep. So all this changes with the Viet Cong Tet Offensive and American request for 1 ATF to operate outside of the province. It's interesting to note that Wilton wasn't a fan of this. He didn't want 1 ATF to adopt this requirement, but nevertheless, this is what happens. Yep. Operation Coburg, it develops a model, if you like, of how to operate outside of this static model. Yep. And you can see the map there. Basically, what involves is a forward element from 1 ATF goes to the new operational area to provide resupply, and in turn that is supported by a forward element of 1 LSG that latches on for the nearest and largest American base. And they resupply the 1 ATF forward element from there. Yep. For those of you who know Gus Gilmore, previous SOCOM commander, on his right there, that's his father, who was one of the commanders of LHG. Yep. I'll talk about this Field 1909 field regulations in question time if you want to, but it really goes to the core of the Army's cultural issue with, if you like, the operational side and not talking to the logistics side. Because in 1909, there was no requirement in the British Army Field Service regulations to do this. Yep. So Coburg exposes a number of failures, basically incorrect scaling, incorrect planning, and incorrect assumptions about what's going to be supplied. Yep. Yep. Yeah, and I'll just move it along. So at a Tongfang 1, a number of incorrect assumptions are made, really. So when it comes to Tongfang 2 and we arrive at Coral Balmoral, there's a shortage of a whole lot of stuff, particularly defence stores, particularly ammunition, and particularly water. Yep. And if it wasn't for the ability of CH-47s to resupply the task force during the Coral Balmoral battles, I think it would have fallen over. Certainly, it was too far for a road resupply, and it was only the fact there was no interference with CH-47 airlift, either by the weather or by the North Vietnamese, that the Australian task force was able to sustain itself through those two major battles. Yep. Yeah, from sandbags with water bottles. Yeah, done that before. So the basic lessons is that, yeah, the concept worked well, but again, it needed better and accurate planning data, better coordination, and also a few other dedicated requirements. Yep. Drawdown and withdrawal, yes. So the US Army begins to withdraw. Support can no longer come from Vung Tau, the American assets, has to come from Long Bin. Everything becomes a lot more complex. Note that the position of CO is now made up to a full colonel at long last. Yep. Those are two of the commanders, Simpkin on the right and Stevenson on the left during their command changeover ceremony. Yep. Army wants a single withdrawal out of Vietnam. The government says no, it's going to be phased. And this, of course, prolongs the whole logistic support requirement. But basically, the withdrawal comes under two operations, Timothy and Interfuse. Yep. Timothy is a withdrawal of the tank squadron. Of course, those very handy ships that we had, the LSMs, no longer in existence. So they go out and hire a Japanese vessel. Only trouble is even their cranes couldn't get it on board. But the tanks have to be modified to actually get them into the hull. Yep. Quarantine and cleaning of equipment goes on basically 24/7 with New South Wales quarantine officer inspectors looking at each piece of equipment that's been cleaned. And for the first time, Army uses containers, and that's a bit of a blessing because they shove stuff in containers, they seal the door with the quarantine inspection certificate, and that speeds up the whole process. Yeah. As I said before, the barrels are taken out of the tanks and the rear engine decks are removed because that's the only way the Japanese ship's crane can get them aboard. Yep. Operated interfuse, which is a larger one, is again a three-phase withdrawal. Part of the convoy. Yep. Major features. Even though they're being drawn down, the demand for logistics services still remain. Yep. Shipping capacity really dictates the timetable. And there are residual forces that remain, of course, which have to be supported even though the task force is gone. Yep. That's the actual withdrawal timing phase. Basically, the blue dots are the ships when they're available, when they can be in port, and that dictates the whole withdrawal timing line and phases. Yep. Last commander, LSG and 1 ATF become one of the same. And he's the last commander. Yep. Yep. So this lesson for logistic planners, these lessons come out of the 1971 CGS exercise, which I think accumulates probably the largest group of expertise on Vietnam War ever gathered, because they're all ex-commanders. And these are the lessons I come up with, and we'll just go through them quickly because there's not a lot of time left. Yep. One of the big ones is don't rely on the allies when you first arrive in country, because it's more than likely they have their own problems. And guess what? This proves to be the case again in Somalia. Australian over equipment, if you deploy with Australian owned equipment, then there's a price to be paid in terms of logistic support, particularly when most Australian equipment is unique from the part that you're deploying with. Yep. The other big lesson, I think, deployment priorities, and where possible, log units should go in advance. There's no reason why one LSG could not have been deployed to Vung Tau, given a couple of weeks to set up and then the rest of the task force deployed. But we have this thing about putting the combat troops in first, even if there's no real requirement. Yep. Timings, yeah, all common sense really. If you're asking people to do their work, defend themselves and provide support at the same time, of course they're going to get tired. Yeah. Selection of a logistics site, they'll always be, if they meet all the requirements, they'll always be in short supply. If anything's good, will be already taken. Yep. Environmental conditions, they really need to be looked at before you arrive. And again, field hygiene troops should go in first as well to mitigate some of these environmental issues. Yep. Headquarters, you know, pretty mundane stuff. Tell them what you want to do and man them appropriately. Yep. Defence, it's always a compromise. But if you really want to just logistics site defended, then you need to give it a dedicated defence force. Yep. Accommodation, these will always vary. And you need to set your guidelines early on, or you'll end up with a huge variation of equipment. I think there's something like 300 different sorts of air conditioners in South Vietnam being operated by the Americans and the Australians. Yeah. By all means, use contract labour, but they come with a cost, both in terms of management, welfare, and security. Yeah. Again, yep. People are always the problem. If you don't look after them, if you don't give them, recognise that they're people, they need rest, relaxation, issues will arise, and they did, because the people didn't. Yep. That's it.